thank you. Got it.
Brent, good. Well, a little better. A little better? Everything's turned on? Turned on. Right on. So, what are you hearing? Yeah, it's hard to put into words, Jojo. I hear more sounds, but they're not the same as how I hear the other one with the record. Whoa. 12 different, from low frequency to high frequency, there's 12 different channels. Right. They all turned up at different volumes. Wow. Wow. So so are you going to have your left ear done? Will you have your left ear done? I don't know. Yeah. Right. Oh yeah, because right now your brain has to. Yes. Wow. Are you sleeping any better? I can get off to sleep. Oh, there you go. So you sleep. You still sleep like a rock. Sleep like a rock. You sleep well. Nice. I got a new pillow. I got a new bed. Ah, very good. Very good. Yeah. That always helps. That always helps. Well, awesome. I'm stoked for you. Wow. Frank, thank you. Oh, Lula.
Okay.
Okay, that one. Can you go with that one? Okay, yeah, well,
Right, we have to get this just right. There we go. There we go.
thank you.
We're live at Vegas. My father was of a different generation, of course, and he liked to go out to Las Vegas. He liked to gamble. But I must say he was a very disciplined kind of guy because he never really blew it. He'd give himself a certain amount of money for a vacation, and he would go out to Vegas, and if he lost it, he'd come home. And he was expecting to lose a certain amount of money. But he did enough, and because he was a regular, and the way they worked it in Las Vegas, he would get free airplane tickets out there. The casinos would fly him out and give him a hotel room. And it sounds more impressive than it is. I mean, it's a middle class kind of gambling. This is not like highfalutin stuff. Pardon? I don't know what he played. Yeah, I don't know. But at the end of the performer's life, he went to one of those big Las Vegas shows with Elvis performing. The final stage of Elvis when he was in those pantsuits with all sorts of sequins and fringe and everything. They have some of those on YouTube you can find. I love it. And he loved Elvis. He had never paid any attention to Elvis just for generational reasons. And there he was. When Elvis made Vegas, it was okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. So we are in Michael Carrithers' book, Buddha. And I think we're on page 62. Is that what other people have too? Anybody know if that's wrong? We started in on the cause of suffering. So we had finished, we're now in the Buddha's discovery and teachings, and had done the Four Noble Truths, the beginning of the existence of suffering. And now we had started on the cause, and I don't know if we should backtrack a little bit or not, but we made some progress in the cause of suffering. But the existence of cause itself, of suffering itself, the existence of suffering is such a radical insight. And what I mean is not just the kind of the concept of it, but the acceptance of it. Because if you think, we're always fighting, thinking that there shouldn't be suffering or something. I think this is actually kind of a glimmer of our recognition of our true nature. Because it seems to me that if we didn't have this innate sense that somehow, suffering is just a little off. Otherwise, if our nature was suffering, we'd be completely in accord with the fact of suffering. And I think it's just a genius, the words that the Buddha used, the images that he used. They're so solid, so to speak. They're so descriptive. Because even this word, dukkha, what is translated as suffering, it's the word in Sanskrit, or he didn't speak Sanskrit, but highly related language. But it's this word that is the same thing for. Is this right? I'm not sure. I better stop on that. I'm thinking of a different word. The upside down effects. But dukkha is a state of dissatisfaction. So it's more than just suffering. When I say more, it encompasses more experience. It's not just simply what we think of as suffering, like breaking your leg or having your feelings hurt or anything like that. But it's this actual state of samsaric existence where everything is there's no permanence, and there's no peace that's really reliable. Even peace itself creates anxiety because we're afraid of losing it. So this state of suffering, to have a deep insight into that is so helpful because it avoids what's called suffering on top of suffering. I think in some of the Zen teachers will say it's like it's enough to suffer, but we put a head on the top of our head. So we suffer over the fact that there is suffering rather than just the suffering being enough. And of course that's a distraction too. So he goes from there to the cause of suffering. And the interesting thing is, he's looking in seeking the cause of suffering. He was seeking something that was active and purposeful, which, like an agent, something impersonal, you might say. So it's very kind of scientific. But at any rate, I'm at the top of page 62, where it says he had to break through to find a principle which was in many ways like an agent or person, but which was finally impersonal, not an agent or person at all. And this is what he discovered. And this, O monks, is the truth of the arising of suffering. We're saying the cause of suffering, but the arising. It is just thirst or craving which gives rise to repeated existence, which is bound up with impassioned appetite, and which seeks fresh pleasure now here and now there, namely a thirst for sensual pleasures, thirst for existence, thirst for non-existence. So thirst or craving is that which drives the whole mass of suffering experience forward. The word tanha bears the literal sense of thirst, and it is this meaning that lends the term its vividness. Its technical sense, however, is craving or desire. In this sense, it is insatiable craving, quote, which seeks fresh pleasure now here and now there, unquote. Not only in this life, but in the lives beyond, and because of this, it gives rise to repeated existence. Moreover, insofar as craving is bound up with impassioned appetite, the metaphor of fire was never far from the Buddha's mind. And indeed, in a discourse traditionally placed very early in his career, the fire sermon, every facet of experience is described as aflame with desire. The fire sermon, some think, is perhaps the first teaching he gave after the Four Noble Truths. And he gave it in Gaya, so his realization was in Bodh Gaya, which is some distance away from the modern town of Gaya, city of Gaya. And his first teaching, of course, was in a suburb of Varanasi, Sarnath, the deer park. Varanasi is the oldest continually habitated city in the world. And the Buddha, of course, gave this first teaching in like a suburb of Varanasi. But the fire sermon was given in Gaya in the, what's the term? Is the crater, do volcanoes have craters? Is that what we call the empty spot on top? Yeah. Yeah, he gave it, the fire sermon, in the crater of an extinct volcano. So it's very powerful from the top to the bottom. This way of thinking is in many ways poetical rather than soberly technical, and a good deal of the Buddha's effort around and after the awakening must have been devoted to drawing out the implications of this pregnant idea. Certainly craving could be shown to be purposive. To crave is to crave something. To be thirsty is to be thirsty for something. Where does this craving come into being and settle itself? Wherever there is what seems lovable and gratifying, there it comes into being and settles. Those are the Buddha's words. In most descriptions of craving, there is a tendency to emphasize the positive desire for sensual pleasure. This was the Puritanism of the renouncers speaking. So these are the wandering ascetics who, were kind of a movement in the Buddha's time, and a new movement in Indian society. Indeed, the idea of desire was common among the renouncers. It was the great obstacle to achieving the self, the Atman, or purifying the soul. But in elevating it to an autonomous principle, the Buddha expanded its definition. For him, craving also included aversion, and that is probably the sense of thirst for non-existence that he stated. One craves not only what is attractive, but also relief or escape from what is unpleasant or undesirable. And we crave a great deal. We crave all sensual pleasures, sexual, gustatory, olfactory, tactile, or whatever. We yearn keenly to escape pain. We crave wealth, power, position. We even lust sensually after our own bodies, or in rebirth, a new body. There is even a thirst for views, the urge to be right, to be in the know, to have an answer for every question. Craving may be spoken of comprehensively as thirst for existence. This is, to be sure, the thirst which gives rise to repeated existence, but perhaps a better way is to think of it as the desire for becoming other than what present experience gives. Under many guises, it is a ceaseless striving for some new state, some new being, some new experience, at the same time as being a striving for satiety and permanence, and it is a striving always frustrated. The world, in the sense of all common individuals in the world, whose nature is to become other, is committed to becoming, has exposed itself to becoming. It relishes only becoming, yet what it relishes brings fear, and what is fear it fears is pain. Rebirth may be rebirth from moment to moment of experience, or it may be rebirth in another life, but in either case, it is the consequence of this lust to be something else. And of course, that lust to be something else, you can see how this comes just completely out of the First Noble Truth, the fact of this dissatisfactory state that we're in. Because from moment to moment to moment, you want to be something else. And this is the nature of it. It's never settled, never happy in a permanent, real way. This is the I can't say this word, purposive, yeah. Is that a word anyway? This guy's a Brit. I don't know that I trust him. This is the purposive activity of craving on a large scale, as it embraces all sentient life. The Tibetans say, you see the birds. We always think, it's like the Audubon Society or something. And look at all the pretty birds. But, they say they're always hungry. They're always looking around for everything. It's never ending. But this grand vision is to be justified, as ever in the Buddhist teaching, by reference to the fine grain of experience. In this perspective, craving was in fact already written into the 5 skandhas, the 5 aggregates. That comprehensive description of mental and physical experience, its impulses, the samskaras. Let us return to the example of the pains in the knees one feels when trying to sit for long periods in insight meditation. Just because one feels these as unpleasant, one also feels an urge to change position, an impulse to seek comfort and relief by moving. This impulse is, in effect, just the active, purposive aspect of the unpleasant feeling. It arises with the unpleasant feeling. It is indeed inseparable from it. In ordinary circumstance, one would simply shift position automatically, without reflecting or perhaps even without being conscious of it. The same might be said for pleasant feelings. While meditating, one might feel sleepy and dreamy, and one is moved automatically to follow and indulge such feelings. Or one feels hungry and thinks of having a little snack before continuing. Without the attempt at meditation, many such impulses would hardly be noticed. So instantly do they follow one after another. In this microscopic view, experience is revealed as having a foundation of ceaseless activity, of short-lived, purposive impulses. The Buddha indeed thought of this activity as making experience. What is called mentality and mind and consciousness arises and ceases in one way and another throughout the day and night, just as a monkey raging through a forest seizes a branch and letting go seizes another. That's a quote from the Buddha too. The perception through insight meditation of an animating principle of existence ruled the Buddha's thought. It was the evidence which guided his understanding of the human condition. Because impulse is habitual and automatic, fundamentally unreflective, and not a function of decision, there was no reason to think of it as the work of some person or self, the Atman, as other renouncers thought. It was just a propensity, an active disposition at the base of life, which had the special and disastrous ability to reproduce itself endlessly. As a propensity, he called it clinging, upadana. This propensity was, in fact, already written into the noble truth of suffering, for the full form of that reads, all aspects of experience in the mind and body, in which clinging inheres, are suffering. That's the Buddha's words, but so this is something you often don't see, his actual words. All aspects of experience in the mind and body in which clinging inheres are suffering. So in other words, these 19th century Protestant missionaries who came across the first noble truth, all life is suffering, like I keep repeating, they thought this was extremely negative, even nihilistic. But of course they left out the words in which clinging inheres. So in other words, in this first noble truth, the second noble truth is included. You get rid of the clinging, you get rid of, actually all four noble truths is there. You get rid of the clinging, you get rid of the suffering. The different terms, clinging, craving, impulse, thirst, each shed a different light on the activity behind and within sentient life. They all point to one thing, the impersonal active principle, the discovery of which answered the Buddha's question, how did I come to be in this sorry plight? Really amazing. And you see, this is what's so remarkable to me about all of Buddha's teachings, because it's so vast. There are just so many aspects, you might say, so many facets of this diamond of truth. And yet it's all just one thing. So all these different terms, clinging, craving, impulse, thirst, these are the basic terms, especially of the self-liberation path. They're deeply profound, and they're all pointing. The Buddha did not consider, however, that craving acts alone. His idea of causes by no means required a single or a simple solution to the problem. While craving might be the chief motive cause in the painful process of rebirth, there was room for a subsidiary enabling causes, conditions without which it could not take hold. And among these, there was one which had an especially important place, ignorance or delusion. The idea was current among the wanderers and yogis. They enjoyed a special knowledge of which others were ignorant. In the Buddha's usage, however, his knowledge was not so much an esoteric truth, like knowledge of the self, knowledge of the Atman, but rather a penetrating understanding of things as they are. By comparison, people are ordinarily not so much uninformed, as one might be uninformed of tax laws or of the Atman, but positively deluded. They hold that the world contains lasting and secure satisfactions, wherein in fact it's riddled with suffering. They are mistaken, so craving has its way with them. The relationship between craving, ignorance, and suffering is rather like the relationship between heat, oxygen, and fire. Heat is the motive force, but without oxygen, fire could not arise. And then the Buddha, thirst for existence, O monks, has a specific condition. It is nourished by something. It does not go without support. And what is that nourishment? It is ignorance. Unquote. Now the book has a next section, the moral significance of human craving. We might be able to get through that tonight. So far, these teachings are amoral. They are the utterances of a detached specialist, a renouncer, addressing himself to others with the same concern for personal salvation. But the Buddha was also convinced that sentient beings are subjected to a law of moral causation, and he was deeply concerned with the evaluation of behavior and its effects on others. So these amoral teachings are indissolubly linked in his thought with others that point to a radically moral significance in the human condition. Let us begin with impulses. As I have so far described them, impulses hardly have a moral significance, but they may be regarded from another point of view. They may be considered as intentions or choices, both of which are included in the key term setana. Sometimes choice is the best translation, insofar as it is a mental movement which precedes action or speech. But intentions are also included, for the Buddha thought that unexpressed intentions could themselves have an effect, if not outwardly, then inwardly in the mind. The Buddha held that in human affairs it is the mental choice or intention which is of ultimate significance. The world is led by mind. Hence, for example, in the legal system developed for the Buddhist order, only intentional acts are regarded as transgressions, and unintentional acts, such as those committed while asleep or mad or under duress, are not culpable. This has great implications. It means that intentions are not negligible, that they have consequences. They do work, are in themselves actions. This in the sense of the term karma, whose primary meaning is just work or deed, but in this Buddhist sense, mental action. Karma does not refer to the results of action, as we now assume in ordinary usage in the West. It is choice or intention that I call karma, mental work. For having chosen, a man acts by body, speech, and mind. That's from the Buddha too. It is choice or intention that I call karma, mental work. For having chosen, a man acts by body, speech, and mind. Unquote. Intentions make one's world. It is they that do the work whose consequences we must reap in suffering. They form the subsequent history of our psychic life as surely as wars or treaties, plagues or prosperity form the subsequent history of a nation. To speak of impulses and urges is not necessarily to speak in moral terms, but choices and actions are the very stuff of moral discourse. One may make good or bad choices, one's actions may be good or evil, and in fact, from the Buddha's point of view, unconscious impulses are really to be equated with conscious choices. The only difference being that impulses occur in ignorance of their nature as choices. They are choices made under the delusion that there is no better choice, no better way of acting. In this light, the relatively neutral term thirst, craving, may itself be considered as greed, something morally reprehensible. And frequently the Buddha spoke in just this way. Greed may be supported by sheer delusion about the nature of the world, but it is also immoral, a propensity to be condemned and in oneself to be improved upon. Moreover, greed is always coupled in the discourses with hatred or aversion. Hence, from a radically moral standpoint, it is by choosing badly, by being greedy and hateful, that we bring upon ourselves the suffering we meet in birth after birth. The ill that we cause ourselves and the ill that we cause others are of a piece, stemming from the same roots. The noble truth of the arising of suffering, second noble truth, could be rephrased thus: inflamed by greed, incensed by hate, confused by delusion, overcome by them, obsessed in mind, a man chooses for his own affliction, for others' affliction, for the affliction of both, and experiences pain and grief. Or in other words, the propensities of greed, hatred, and delusion, which cause us to injure others through evil deeds, are exactly the same propensities which cause us to suffer ourselves by being reborn in life after life. The moral cause in transmigration is equivalent to the cause of suffering. But this raises a fundamental question: how exactly does this cause work? For a doctrine of a self or soul, it is easy enough. The self acts, causes consequences to itself, and is reborn again according to its deserts. The basic structure is in its own terms plausible, so the details are not so important. But what if there is no self? The answer works backwards from the appearance of a new body and mind, a new psychophysical entity. How did this appear? It appeared through the descent of consciousness into a mother's womb. On the face of it, this is primitive, going back to earlier Indian ideas of a homunculus descending into the womb. And it is speculative, going beyond the Buddha's brief of attending only to what he could witness himself. But later Buddhist commentaries are clear that this descent is metaphorical, as we might say, darkness descended on him if someone falls unconscious. Moreover, this enlivening consciousness is not an independent entity, but a disguised self. But it is composed of causes and conditions. So what in turn were these preceding conditions? One was the act of physical generation, but more important was a previous impulse. Here, impulse is to be understood as intention or mental action bearing a moral quality and informing by that quality the nature of the new psychophysical entity. If the impulse was good, the new body and mind will be well endowed and fortunately placed. If not, it'll be poorly endowed and unfortunate. And now comes the key question: what is this mysterious impulse? It is in fact nothing other than the final impulse, the dying thought of the previous mind and body. It is nothing like a self, but is merely a last energy which leaps the gap from life to life, rather like, as a later Buddhist source put it, a flame leaping from one candle wick to another. Nor is it free of preceding conditions, for it is the product of the dispositions formed by habitual mental actions conducted under the veil of ignorance and desire within the previous life, and thus one can trace the process back to beginningless time, in fact. In this account, there is no underlying entity, but there is a stream of events which has its own history. This history is borne forward not by a self or a soul, but by the complex interaction of the causes, conditions, and effects summarized under craving and suffering. To understand this interaction is to understand the nature and origins of the human condition. Many canonical accounts treat this as the substance of the awakening itself. The Buddha called it dependent co-origination, praticca samutpada. It was dependent in that the causes and conditions necessarily interact with each other, as do fuel, heat, oxygen, and so forth in the production of fire. No one of them is finally independent, a self or as a self or a soul might be. So dependent co-origination served two functions in his teachings. It refuted the idea of an independent, permanent soul, and it described the origin of suffering. The doctrine attached to dependent co-origination includes everything I have discussed under the first two noble truths, though it is phrased somewhat differently. It usually, but not always, comprises 12 factors. These range from those describing the psychophysical entity, such as sense organs and feeling, to the descriptions of the sources of suffering, namely ignorance, craving, clinging, and impulses. And of course it includes suffering as well. Though we might speculate that, as a doctrine, dependent co-origination appeared after the Four Noble Truths, It was, in fact, already inherent in them. In the Buddha's understanding of craving and suffering and the interactions through which craving causes suffering. So that's kind of heady, all of that stuff. But what I take from it, one thing is, I mean, again, the Buddha is like scientific, looking directly at the mind. What's actually going on in our mind? And then the causes and conditions. I mean, how remarkable. You can see this incredible specificity. And of course, that is the source of effectiveness. You might say compassion, effective action, because you're dealing with what is. What are the actual dynamics going on? It very much is like science. If you can control the causes, you control the results. But of course, this is extremely dynamic. This is not just on a materialistic, level like lighting a match or something. But even there, when you look deeply into those things, pretty miraculous, really. This world that we, sensual world that we inhabit. So here you are, the first two noble truths, and already there's this amazing insight into just what's actually going on in the mind. And of course, then the next two noble truths is how do you use this understanding of cause and effect for your benefit. And all of this, of course, is not apart from others. You were talking about the actual nature of reality. And of course, other beings are in this reality too. So interestingly, although, you sometimes get things in kind of a, almost like in a political way, here's all these, I think there were 13 or 17, I can't remember, different schools of the self-liberation path. And then the Mahayana arising later historically. But the Mahayana is only speaking to what was inherent in Buddha's teachings from the get-go. There's nothing there that is new, maybe expressions, but it's similar here, how he's already using all these different terms, craving, thirst, impulse, in a sense, talking about the same thing. But in this expanded, vocabulary, it's one teaches us inherently just kind of the vastness of it all, but also the specificity. You can look from different angles, and it's this, this exploration, this path, this journey. And of course, that's very useful. So sometimes people are overwhelmed by all the different terms. I mean, again, Dharmakaya, Dharmadhatu, Prajnaparamita, Yeshe, Jnana, it just, all these terms. And yet so many of them are really, the genius of it is that they're not synonyms, but they're approaching things from a slightly different angle, but we're all looking at something that in a sense can't be described. So those are the first two noble truths. All right, any reactions or anything? I had some footnotes from Lobsang Lalungpa with the Four Noble Truths too, and see if there's anything there that might be useful right now. But anything, anybody? Not easy listening to all that reading. Yes, there you go.
Oh, thanks, Dave. Thank you. Thank you. I'm kind of stuck in my position. Hey, Frank, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
I've been trying to read the Bible again. Just because it's interesting. But anyway, it seems like from the Christians believe that the God made suffering so it would force man to look towards God. Is there anything in Buddhism besides that say that this suffering is something that's good for us? Okay, there we go.
No, suffering is unhappiness, right? Right. When your child's suffering, you don't think, oh, this will be good for them to suffer. You try to relieve the suffering. To me, it's so simple in that way. It's so simple that we can't accept it, Forgive me if you've heard this story before, but I went to a YMCA camp for a month in the summertime when I was a kid. My parents would get rid of me for a month. And they had all these different kind of activities and even competition. So the month would end with this big competition with all the different skills that things that people were doing in the month. Like the sailboat. I could never swim far enough to get on a sailboat. They kept me in a rowboat. I never even made it to the canoe. But nonetheless, you had to swim, I think, 100 yards to get into, 40 yards to get into a rowboat, 100 yards to get into a canoe. You had to swim like a quarter of a mile to get into a sailboat. And then they had different level sailboats. It was quite a wonderful camp. And one of the competitions at the end was log rolling. Like the old lumberjacks getting on a big log floating in the water, and you run on it and try not to fall in. So we had this log rolling competition. It was part of the final things. You had different, you lived in a cabin, and there were different cabins. The cabins would compete with each other, so it was all very, competitive. And my cabin was chosen to do the log rolling, to start the log rolling competition. Now they had this giant log floating out there in the water, and it had a chain that connected it to the bottom of the lake. And as you rolled on it, it would roll, and the chain eventually would make it roll backwards again. So it was like this, and people would fall off. It was great fun. And we had been playing with this because every day you had swimming, and it's in the swimming area, so people were familiar with this. But at any rate, the competition was starting, and I was the first one up. And you had to stay on, if you stayed on for a minute, that's the best you could do. They would just blow a whistle, and that was the whole thing, if you could make it for a minute. So I swam out there, but the log, no one had been on it, so it was totally motionless. And in fact, the top was all dried because it hadn't been spinning through the water. And I got up on the log, stood up on the log, and it wasn't moving, so there wasn't anything to it. You just stand there and wait for the minute to pass by. But of course, like some sort of a brain dead kid, I thought, well, this isn't fair, so maybe I'll put some suffering into this, and I started running on the thing to make it move. Of course, then I fell off. So I didn't take advantage. It didn't seem fair. But what I'm saying is that even when we're not suffering, because we're in this suffering kind of state, it seems wrong that there's no suffering. So we're going to do some suffering. So I think that's a very human kind of view. We're all so complex as human beings and have this amazing psychologies happening underneath the surface. When we watch the ads on TV and movies, everyone is just like nice and they're all happy. It's like I used to joke about the Schlitz beer ad where they have 13 guys on a sailboat, no women in sight, just Schlitz beer. Everybody having a good time, right? It's like completely unreal. So too, with all our characters and our movies, and especially the mindless ones, you never see the resentments that are really, everybody's running around with resentments, anger, all these emotions are there, but we suppress them socially to look good. And of course, what's happened in history, scapegoats, that's what we do. We just project all our negativity on some guy that we don't like, or some group that we don't like, or some nation that we don't like, or something. Now it's aliens, in the movies.
Aliens are breeding with our women.
There we go. That's right. So that's what we do. So what the point, maybe this isn't a substantial point, but this is what strikes me. If you have Buddhism is this vast view and this correct view, you might say. But even when you say correct, people get a little scary of that because it sounds like, some sort of suppression or something. But the Buddha just saw things as they are, without all the stuff that we put on it to try to hide our own suffering or to ameliorate it in some way or make us feel better, whatever. And one of those things is that somehow suffering is good for us. Now, in Buddhism, yes, the suffering is like a stimulus. And when you recognize the suffering, you know the antidote that you can apply to it. So in that sense, it's useful. But of course, this whole life is useful. That's what's going on. But what's interesting to me is that when we learn about cause and effect, you see the suffering, but that's just the result. And so there's something that you can apply as an antidote. But there's no, and yet there are things in Shantideva, I think somewhere he talks about the amount of suffering that's gone on in all of your lifetimes. If you can try to visualize that, consider that, unbelievable. So the discomfort that comes from spiritual practice in this process of transcending suffering really is nothing in comparison. And Rinpoche even gets, so practical, so speaking to people without this highfalutin way like I do, and he just says it's not bad to suffer a little bit for Dharma. He's saying the same thing as Shantideva, but in a way that we can hear it. And so what happens? Because when our suffering comes up, we make a big deal out of it, don't we? I mean, it's just amazing. It's like a hangnail. Think of it. I mean, the level of dissatisfaction that we have from a hangnail, and it's really nothing. It's really nothing. And yet, losing a night's sleep, whatever it is, your whole day is ruined because someone, I don't know, didn't pay certain kind of obeisance to you. Whatever it is, we have these amazingly fragile, completely artificial and created, mind-created egos. And with that, we're guaranteed to suffer. So, yeah, I think of it, my own idea, understanding of it rather, is that if your view is just a little bit off, it's like going to Mars. If you're just a little bit off, you're going to miss it by a whole lot. And so I think the philosophical view, and we have to be gentle with ourselves. The Buddha had to discover this. He was off as the prince, trying to do things right. And then he went off with meditation. He discovered sort of the inner path. Okay, I'm going to do meditation. And that didn't quite work either. And so then he went on the ascetic path. That didn't work either. Only then, after all of those energies and experience and disappointments, you might say, think what he must have gone through. And of course, this is all without the support of a community and, in ancient Indian way, completely shameful activity. He abandoned his duties of his caste, the warrior caste. They were depending on him to inherit the kingdom. So the courage is just something it's just amazing to me how we care about what people think of us, how they're going to view us, what they're going to say to us. We do so many self-protective things all the time. And that in itself, nothing wrong. Again, this is the genius of the Dharma. You change your mind, all of these things can be done with a different motivation so as not to upset those people. That's totally different than just doing things to protect your own ego. It's completely different. So the karma is different. But nonetheless, I think if your view is off, and so if you don't see, if you have this idea of a self that's some sort of eternal soul thing that is not subject to cause and effect, but it's just out there sort of mysteriously, but you believe in it, then you need something else that's eternal, not subject to causes and conditions, like a God, but an outer kind of God. You're not quite the old man with a white beard, but the same kind of, some sort of concrete idea to have created that. And then, what do you do with suffering? This is the big thing. What do you do with suffering? How does an all-loving God create children in a way that they're guaranteed to suffer? I mean, it's really a profound question. And to my view, the eternalists never really answer that question. They say, well, we just can't know. You can't know God's mind. It's just sort of a mystery, and they've gone through all sorts of reasons of how this might be beneficial. It's leading us back to God, but why do we have to leave God in the first place? I mean, none of these things have ever resonated with me. And Nagarjuna even speaks in some ways about these things, a little bit different because he's dealing with India and not such a strongly theistic God. But nonetheless, there's that. And then you have the other view that, again, the nihilistic view, and they don't have any answer at all. So to me, that the Buddha, right from the First Noble Truth, the existence of suffering, isn't that really what it's all about? And then the cause of suffering. There's a cause for this. It's just so mind-boggling, yet it sounds so simple, you know. So I think this is helpful for us because one thing I like about this book is, Carrithers, I think he has some meditative experience, certainly seems familiar with the modern Vipassana practices for foundations of mindfulness and that. And that's very valuable because, if you think about Tibetans, like, they show up and there's the Lama just giving blessings. And if they go to a teaching, I mean, that's wonderful. But they're not necessarily questioning like we do is this valid, is this not valid? I mean, they're sort of just there. This questioning that we do, the lamas highly, highly value it because we're like the good students, of Tibet, trying to understand. You see the little monks, it's so funny when Megan taught Edgar a monastery in Tibet. You see the little monks, and they're just chanting it out. They're just memorizing. They're just reading stuff. They have no idea. Kempo's told me they have no idea understanding what they're reading, but they're just memorizing like they're ABCs. But later, then they start getting into it, but they have all of this memorized. It's a very interesting system because there are scholars who believe, actually, it's not a rare belief or unique belief that, for instance, Homer had the whole Odyssey memorized. These great poets of the ancient world, they were training themselves a different way. Even in my generation, I don't know about you guys, but memorizing the preamble to the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, and people would memorize the Gettysburg Address. Yeah, they don't. For one thing, they don't believe in memorization. Some of this is rote. You can hear all the things they say about it. But there's something I think about. We used to say learning by heart, and to me, maybe I'm projecting too much onto this, but it's like, this knowledge of the heart. It's like in the Tantra, there's the peaceful deities in the heart, and the wrathful deities in the brain. The heart is just that full moon, and you can imagine the heat of India, and at night looking up, and here's this light, but it's a cool light. It's not burning at all. It's just so beautiful. I guess, especially in cooling and pleasant. This is the power of compassion. And for the wrathful deities, they're on a flame. They're on a sun disk. So you think about it. It's like when you see those photographs they take of the sun. They're so amazing. I mean, just all those nuclear explosions happening all the time. I don't understand why it doesn't even last 5 minutes. But nonetheless, that's the power. So for us, learning by the heart is so unifying. It's not just speculating with your head. If you can do that, of course, if you can get that head part going into the non-conceptual experience and action, well, that's incredibly powerful. But that's why I think it's wrathful, because it looks kind of scary in the way it manifests. But rather the heart. So learning by heart, there's a real wisdom in that. And I've noticed, how the memorization that was done in college, I was studying Russian and French. And sometimes, they'd have you memorize these little things, and it still comes up. It's amazing to me. You learn something by heart, you really learn it. You see Kempo sometimes when he's teaching, someone will ask a question, and he'll be going back through his memorization, trying to figure out the verse, the sentence, and then from that he'll teach on it in a more abstract kind of way. But anyway, that's my point, is that the Tibetans, when they come, they don't necessarily have this kind of questioning, speculating, trying to figure out what was the Buddha actually saying in that kind of way. You don't hear so much about the Four Noble Truths. It'll pop up in sadhanas and that. But this kind of understanding, I think, is very helpful. And also, through that, you start to more deeply appreciate the text that we have, and you see the interdependence of all these various, teachings and exactly is going on, the profundity of it. Okay, boy, I was kind of on a rip there. Sorry. Yeah.
I think it's amazing that, you have that book there, and you have that book there, and that book there. All because of the Four Noble Truths.
There you go. Yeah, Keen's pointing out that I've got books on my little pages stand here. We got this little tiny one on the Four Noble Truths, and then this book on Mahamudra by Takwatashi Namgyal, The Quintessence of Mind and Meditation. This is a great text within the Kagyu, translated by, at the request of I forget my numbers. I think, what Karmapa is it right now? Anyone remember? No, 13th? 14th? Dalai Lama's the 14th. Yeah, maybe. I think it's the 16th Karmapa. Yeah.
He's gone, right?
Yeah, but the previous one, that would be then the 15th Karmapa, asked Lobsang Lalungpa, who was a aristocratic Tibetan from Lhasa who lived in Santa Fe, went to a teaching in America, and the Karmapa gave him this text in Tibetan and said, please translate this. He did. So this is an amazing text. If you only read Lobsang Lalungpa's introduction to this book, it is extremely helpful, but also the footnotes. Just go through the footnotes. Don't even go through the text. It's so profound. And then this other one that I've been hauling around now for a couple of weeks, the Nyingma School of Tibetan Buddhism by Dudjom Rinpoche. Similarly, it's just mind-boggling. That's all you can say. And this, again, is so helpful because you see all this. First of all, there's an immediate kind of humility, isn't there? Even where there's no humility, you have to pretend that there's humility because when you see a text like this, yeah, it's 800 pages or something. I know. So, for instance, I read last Sunday this verse from Atisha, and as you know, Atisha is this great figure whose 17 years that he spent in Tibet were really the start of the new schools, the Gelugpa, the Kagyu, and the Sakyas. But he said, this is Atisha, since in the manner of an ocean, its depths and other shores are not found by words, examples, and the intellect, it is the great, profound reality. And of course, this is what you love about the Dharma. It's, it can't be found by words, examples, and intellect. And yet it points to the fact that as human beings, we have a capacity that is deeper than that. Then also from Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Geluks, whoever perceives the cause and result of all things of samsara and nirvana to be always infallible and destroys all their referential bases, at that time enters the path pleasing to the Buddhas. As long as one continues to differentiate between the two understandings of appearances, which are infallibly interdependent, and emptiness, which is free from assertions. If you're seeing appearances here, emptiness here, one will not yet realize the Buddha's intention. But when these understandings are simultaneous, without alternation back and forth, and if, having merely seen interdependence to be infallible, true conviction has destroyed all postures of objective clinging, at that time the scrutiny of the view is perfected. So there you go. Objective clinging, destroying all postures of objective clinging. That's just what we read about, that this thirst is the cause of suffering. So these incredible, mental constructs. And of course, it's very much like this in the visualization practice. You're building this entire pure land of light. But all of that is just to get to this destroying the postures of objective clinging. Now we can do that with the sutric view, this just solid human beings interacting. You don't have to do any of these fancy things. But of course, these things are there, these methods, these practices, to help us because we're so habitual in our ways and so, our assumptions of our, materiality, and we're so used to just believing in the limitations of our mind that when we experience a mind that's a little bit vaster, to us it's like a miracle or some sort of wild experience. So we can do that in these ways, but all of these things are helpful. That said, the Buddha Shakyamuni, came at a very meritorious time, and he basically taught the sutras. The Guru Rinpoche came at a different time, and specifically to teach the Tantra. So for us, we're lucky because we got both, both in spades.
So the Vajrayana uses samsara to free ourselves from samsara?
It uses appearances to get beyond appearances, yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's by seeing the nature of the appearances. And of course, that's why it's so powerful. Because if you want to, like these wandering ascetics of the time, Buddha took their teachings and then transformed it with this more profound meaning and this more immediacy. That's great. But to be able to use is amazing, is really amazing. So it all works together. Okay, anything else from anyone? Where are we? We're at a good... Oh, we're past. We should stop. Sorry. Anything else? Otherwise, let's do the dedication. Yep. Maybe I can even find a dedication. If not, we'll just do one anyway. May the ever-brightening sunlight of the virtuous thoughts and deeds devoted to this text illuminate the dark ignorance of sentient beings. May the luminosity of their self-comprehending awareness increase. May I, too, gain the unobstructed good opportunity of associating myself with this supreme path throughout all future lives. May I realize the Dharmakaya directly and before long, and fulfill the wishes of innumerable sentient beings. May every last one be free. Svaha. Okay.